Kevin McCarthy became the first ever Speaker of the House to be removed by a vote of the House. He was removed earlier today, just a couple of hours ago, by a vote of 216 to 210. That total was 8 House Republicans, including the leader of the resolution, Matt Gaetz of Florida, joining with all 208 House Democrats who voted. 208 House Democrats plus 8 House Republicans equals 216. And only 210 House members, all Republicans, voted to keep Kevin McCarthy. So as a result, the minute that session was gavelled closed and McCarthy had to suffer the indignity of watching his top lieutenant, Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, who did more than anybody probably to engineer McCarthy's election to the House speakership back in January, had to watch him become the temporary House Speaker and gavel close the session in which his close ally was removed. McCarthy is no longer Speaker of the House. The House has no permanent Speaker. It has McHenry, who is serving as, instead, a interim Speaker or a temporary Speaker until the new permanent one is chosen. Now, as shocking as it is, and obviously people can debate whether or not they think Kevin McCarthy should have been removed or not. I'm not surprised that there are all sorts of different views. Obviously, the vast, vast majority of the House Republican caucus voted to keep Kevin McCarthy, and that you can't say they're all establishment hacks or people who want to continue with the system as is. It included people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, a bunch of other Trump supporters, people long considered to be on the right who voted to keep Kevin McCarthy. And at the same time, among the 8 House Republicans who voted to get rid of him are people not generally considered to be on the far right, including Nancy Mace of North Carolina, who often incurred Trump's anger to the point where he supported her primary challenger this last year. But then when she won, despite her primary challenger being supported by Trump, he congratulated her. He has a lot of respect for her, as well as Congressman Ken Buck of Colorado, who I think is one of the most thoughtful and studious members of the House Republican caucus. He is a leading voice on antitrust. Both of them have been on my show before. They're both very constrained and thoughtful, certainly moderate in their comportment. So it's not as though these people are the kind who want to just go around blowing things up. And yet, what's amazing to me is not that there's a difference of opinion on this, but that some people are enraged. In fact, a lot of people are enraged that Kevin McCarthy is no longer House Speaker. Imagine being indignant over the fact that someone as kind of unnotable and mediocre and banal as Kevin McCarthy can't get to be House Speaker anymore. What possibly could motivate someone to be so invested in the idea of Kevin McCarthy? And yet, there are some people who are. To start off, let me just show you how it is that his close lieutenant, his little minion, Patrick McHenry of North Carolina, gavelled the session closed. Watch this.
To the call of the chair.
That's some real rage. Let's watch that again.
Chair declares the House in recess, subject to the call of the chair.
I mean, that almost requires some anger management classes. He is incredibly enraged. And then you have other people who are clearly using very kind of unhinged rhetoric about the fact that Kevin McCarthy was removed. We have, for example, let's take a look at, here is from Igor Bobich, who I believe is a hub reporter with the Huffington Post, at least at one point he's with one of those indistinguishable liberal digital sites, and he wrote the following, quote, Senator John Cornyn of Texas calls the efforts to oust Kevin McCarthy, quote, disgraceful. Quote, we saw a similar thing happen to Boehner, Ryan, and now McCarthy. I'm sure the next speaker is going to be subjected to the same terrorist attacks. Terrorist attacks is how Senator Cornyn described this legislative maneuver to remove Kevin McCarthy. You can tell he's obviously enraged. And then when somebody questioned whether that was really appropriate language to use, here's Chad Hasty saying, wait, did John Cornyn really call this, quote, a terrorist attack? He doubled down on that rhetoric and he said a handful of House members just want to blow up the institution and themselves in the process. Sad. Now, earlier today, a different reporter, I don't know if they're from Politico or Huffington Post or wherever, Sahil Kapoor, maybe he's with CNN. Again, these are all indistinguishable to me. This is how he described the vote that took place just a couple of hours ago in the House. Quote, 6 House Republicans have now voted to overthrow Speaker McCarthy. Overthrow Speaker McCarthy. That was how he did it, as though these House Republicans who are voting on who should be the Speaker of the House are like CIA operatives clandestinely attempting to remove the government of a foreign country. Overthrow the House Speaker. So you see, these people are very upset. And the thing is, people like Sahil Kapoor on any other day of the week, any other day of the year, hate Kevin McCarthy. Kevin McCarthy is a Republican. He's identified as a conservative. That's how he was able to attract conservative votes when he became House Speaker. You kind of have to appeal to all the factions in the House. And yet, he's so upset, Sahil Kapoor is. He's as upset as John Cornyn, who called it a terrorist attack. Sahil Kapoor is calling this a coup, basically, an attempt to overthrow Kevin McCarthy as though he has some like rightful possession of the House speakership. And I think in this conflict are some really interesting dynamics about not just what drove this vote, but is driving our politics generally, namely the question of whether or not people who are invested in politics regard our status quo or our prevailing institutions of authority or the prevailing ideology in Washington as being fundamentally, inherently legitimate and worthy of preservation, or whether you believe that that prevailing order, that prevailing ideology in Washington, this bipartisan consensus, the way of doing business in Washington, ought to be dismantled, subverted, undermined. I don't really think this vote was so much about Kevin McCarthy, because again, why would anybody get worked up one way or the other about Kevin McCarthy? He's just this gray, indistinguishable politician. But he represents symbolically a system that a lot of people either are extremely enraged about and want to destroy, or whether they really want to preserve the status quo and get angry at anybody who undermines and subverts it to the point that they call them terrorists, as John Cornyn said, are trying to overthrow the rightful sequence of power, the hierarchy of power, that even somebody like this reporter who, as I said, hates Kevin McCarthy and the Republican Party is just so upset at any kind of instability. They just want to preserve the status quo. I think that's the most relevant distinction or dichotomy in politics, much more so than left versus right or conservative versus liberal. And I think that's the relevant metric in what drove Kevin McCarthy's ouster. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize. There are obviously a lot of people, again, the vast, vast majority of the House Republican caucus voted to keep Kevin McCarthy. And that includes people like, say, Marjorie Taylor Greene or Paul Gosar, who I don't think anyone can accuse of being so invested in the establishment or wanting to preserve the system. I think it's important to recognize that anytime politicians act, and that includes even your favorites, they're thinking about their own self-interest all the time. And so one reason Kevin McCarthy can command such loyalty, even though he's such a uninspiring figure, to put that mildly, is because there's a whole structure of power in the House that is designed to ensure loyalty to the Speaker. So he gets to dole out every chair of every committee, and these people become very powerful, these chairs of committees. That includes Jim Jordan and a bunch of other people like that, who know that their power in Washington and in Congress and their stature depends upon the Speaker. And as long as Kevin McCarthy is Speaker, the people who are now the chairs of these committees get their way. So they don't want to change. And then underneath these speakers are a bunch of chairs of subcommittees or ranking members or people who get empowered in other ways through their proximity to power. And so even though a lot of the people who voted for Kevin McCarthy in general might have an anti-establishment ideology, a lot of them are simply voting for what advances their own self-interest or their own center of power, which might not even be a bad thing. If you're a politician, you should want power. If you don't have power as a politician, you can't get anything done. So all I'm saying is that although I think the prevailing dynamic here, and in politics generally, is the question of whether someone is pro or anti-establishment, whether or not somebody wants stability or instability, obviously there are some exceptions in terms of people who voted against Kevin McCarthy, and even in people who voted for. Like I said, neither Ken Buck nor Nancy Mace to me are people eager to destabilize the system. But I do think, on the whole, that has driven the impediments put in Kevin McCarthy's path from the moment that he thought he was divinely entitled to the speakership after the Republicans took over and he was next in line, as well as all of the conflict that has led to this moment today when he became the first ever Speaker of the House removed. Now, just to give you a sense for how significant this is, here you see the current front page of the New York Times, and they are blasting and blaring this headline. Now, they have political reasons to do so. They want to show that the Republicans are in all kinds of disarray. But it is a historic moment. House votes to remove McCarthy as Speaker. And then, of course, here you see this idiotic formulation, which is as predictable as it is dumb, that the far-right GOP faction throws the House into chaos. They can't understand anything without reference to right versus left dichotomies, even though so often it doesn't apply. Yesterday and tomorrow, the same New York Times will call Kevin McCarthy hard right or far right. That's just a label they assign to anybody who does something they dislike at any given moment. Here's the roll call vote. And here you see everybody voted in accordance with their party except for these 8 House Republicans. So there are some people on this list who generally get described as being right-wing or far-right, like Matt Rosendale of Montana, and obviously Matt Gaetz of Florida, Andy Biggs of Arizona, people like that. But then there are some who are generally considered more moderate. This is not a far-right versus moderate Republican conflict. So here you see Nancy Mace, who, as I said, has often incurred Trump's rage, and even Ken Buck. And I would perhaps put Bob Good into that category as well. And then here you see the Democrats, just all of them automatically voted yes. So every single Democrat voted yes to remove Kevin McCarthy. Again, there were 4 House Republicans and 4 House Democrats. 2 of the House Democrats, for example, who didn't vote include Cori Bush and Nancy Pelosi. And then there were a couple of House Republicans, at least among the 4, who didn't vote or who just abstained because they likely supported Kevin McCarthy's removal. So they didn't want to give him they want to give a no vote, but they also didn't want to give a yes vote. So they just abstained, and in reality, that helped Kevin McCarthy. The Democrats who abstained, helped Kevin McCarthy, and that included Nancy Pelosi, notably, as well as Cori Bush. The Republicans who abstained basically undermined Kevin McCarthy, even though they didn't want to vote yes. So the only votes you really need to recall are these 8 yes votes from the House Republican caucus. Those made the difference. And I don't think you can characterize those either as being a far-right versus moderate dichotomy. That's the only framework that media outlets and paid political and professional pundits can understand, even though increasingly it has nothing to do with what happened here. Now, the question is then, what did happen here? Why did Kevin McCarthy get removed? So here is Matt Gaetz, who you see him surrounded by a throng of journalists. He's obviously the most relevant person in Congress at the moment, at least as of today, whether you agree with him or not. He removed the House Speaker almost single-handedly. And here he is explaining why he did what he did.
Why should he want the job after this just happened?
Well, that's a question for him, I guess, not me.
He said he's uninterested. He's already said he's
I haven't heard him say that.
No, he's already.
What has he said to you?
Well, here's what I would say. Here's what I say. I think a lot of members are going to reflect on their thinking after this historic moment. I think anything that people have said before the McCarthy ouster is probably bearing less weight than the way people may be thinking about these questions after the McCarthy ouster.
So this had a lot to do with who was going to be the next speaker. It is possible Kevin McCarthy could become speaker again. But in order for that to happen, I assume he would have to make even more concessions to Matt Gaetz and to this group who voted no. But if you listen to the people who voted no, or rather who voted to remove Kevin McCarthy, they're essentially citing 2 or 3 different reasons, all in common. Number one is that McCarthy reached an agreement with the Biden White House and House and Senate Democrats about 6 weeks ago to extend the debt ceiling to keep government spending at $2.2 trillion per year of a deficit spending and 30-something trillion dollars in debt. And a lot of them are simply saying, who voted to remove Kevin McCarthy, we just cannot continue this system any longer. We're going to go bankrupt. We're going to drown in debt. We're borrowing all this money we're spending from China. It's just unsustainable. And it's just time to draw the line and say, we're not going to support the continuation of this way of doing business any longer. Ukraine also played a significant role in what happened because the efforts to avert a government shutdown over the last week were successful because it was widely reported. Matt Gaetz entered into a secret agreement with congressional and Senate Democrats to ensure a continuation of funding for Ukraine. There were several votes last week to try and ensure that funding for Ukraine would be included in the bill that got passed to keep the government running, and there were just not enough votes in the House Republican caucus. Roughly half of the House Republican caucus is now voting no on further funding for the war in Ukraine. And there was no funding included for the war in Ukraine in this measure to keep the government running. Now, the reality is the Biden White House already has about $5 billion already authorized that it hasn't used, that it continues to draw down, but they are eager to get another $24 billion. That's the amount they demanded for more funding in Ukraine. And they told Zelensky and everybody in Kiev, oh, don't worry, we have a secret deal to ensure that more spending is coming. They made a secret deal with Kevin McCarthy, and a lot of the people who voted to remove him are enraged that McCarthy, knowing there weren't enough votes to keep funding the war in Ukraine, nonetheless did a side deal with the Democrats, which is why the Democrats were cackling, even as they were accusing the Republicans of being traitors and giving Putin a gift, because they knew this funding was coming because of the deal that Kevin McCarthy negotiated. And then finally, there's just kind of a trust issue that they say Kevin McCarthy lies constantly and says whatever he needs to say at any given moment, and that you can't trust him. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.